Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give a minute or so for people to come into the room. Glad you're here. Welcome. Welcome. We're glad you're here. We'll just give a minute, a couple seconds for everybody to come into the room, and happy to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome, welcome. Well, I think we'll get started now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Unlocking Talent, Attracting and Retaining Diverse Talent, What Works for Students from Forté Partner Schools. I'm Rachel Harrington, Director of Corporate Partnerships at Forté, and we're really excited to be diving into this topic today. Forté partners with companies and universities and business schools in pursuit of our joint mission of more women leading. Our work spans leadership conferences and business education collaborations and targeted professional development initiatives that connect women with career opportunities they may not have discovered on their own. It creates a richer, larger pool of exceptional candidates across industries and functions. And in addition to talent identification, we also serve as a strategic partner to organizations to offer the guidance and resources necessary to attract and retain this outstanding talent. And today is an opportunity for us to do just that and to really explore insights directly from our students at our Forté partner schools around what truly captures their attention and builds lasting connections for them. So through survey data from our Forté student ambassadors, we'll discover actionable strategies for maximizing your recruiting impact, whether through conference sponsorships or coffee chats or other innovative approaches beyond a traditional info session. And our Forté experts will share what works, what doesn't, and answer any questions you have through this session. So before we begin, a couple logistics. We're excited to take any questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat feature for that. And with that, I'm excited to introduce my colleagues, Ashley Lotzenheiser and Leah Lattimore, to share their insights. Ashley and Leah, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Our pleasure to be here today to be talking about this topic. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Ashley Lotzenheiser. I'm the Director of Pre-MBA programs here at Forté, so I get to work with our audience of women that have graduated from undergrad and are in their kind of early career as they journey potentially to an MBA program. So we also run programming for candidates as they apply to MBA programs and then are matriculating into programs. So I'll let Leah, if you want to introduce yourself and a little bit about your role here as well.
Sure. Thank you, Ashley. And so I am Leah Lattimore. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Programs here at Forté. And so I work with our students who are pursuing bachelor's degrees across the country. And so a lot of our work focuses on preparing them for different careers in business across all industries, and certainly considering the MBA as a next step for them, regardless of where they land. And we often work very closely, Ashley and I, on thinking about how we make that connection and support our audiences as they're transitioning into the workforce.
Cool. And as Leah mentioned, we work closely together. Our audiences blend into one another. So who's in Leah's audience today will be in my audience in the near future. So we work collaboratively a lot and often talk about the trends that we're seeing in these women as well. So one of the things that we wanted to start with was talking a bit about kind of the big picture of industry interest. And Leah and I have both kind of been in this business, if you will, for a while now, we'll say. And we've definitely seen some trends here. But kind of big picture, Leah, are there any types of jobs that you think candidates right now are particularly interested in?
Absolutely. So I think, especially with our college audience within Forté, we're seeing a lot of student interest in consulting and financial services. Financial roles, whether it's corporate finance or fintech, are of great interest to our students. And so we see a lot of engagement with that. I think there's also been an uptick of interest in kind of tech, luxury marketing, and even HR, with a lot of our students asking about different opportunities and pathways there. But I'll say generally what I'm seeing and what research tends to show right now is that Gen Z is expressing an increased interest in media and entertainment, which I don't think is surprising if we think about the way that folks are monetizing their social media presence and able to create lifestyles and careers off of social media content. So I think we're certainly seeing that and the business acumen that's required for that. I think, but overall, regardless of whether it's, consulting or media and entertainment, a lot of what we're seeing is an interest and an increase in demand on flexibility, entrepreneurial experiences, and some level of personalization. So our students are looking to stand out in some way and also be effective in their roles.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the other interesting area that we have kind of on the early career side, especially as candidates look towards post-MBA roles, is an interest in leadership development or leadership rotational programs where candidates get the opportunity to see multiple aspects of the business and position themselves well for future leadership. That interest in roles within an organization that allow them to basically see, as I said, different parts of the business, but also be shown what a pathway to future leadership looks like. So rather than just starting in a role and kind of moving their way up the ladder, they wanted a little bit more of this roadmap of what future potential growth at an organization might look like, and somewhat of an investment in them as an employee going forward as well. So I think today, Leah, one of the things we wanted to do is talk a little more kind of like practicalities for maybe some of our corporate partners or for any of our partners as they think about candidates. And one thing that we often talk to candidates about when we think about the job search process is their experience with career expos. As one of the big things that they'll go to, whether it's at a conference, at their school, at a third-party organization, they'll attend many, many, many expos. And for in-person expos, it was really interesting to hear kind of what do you think makes the difference for candidates when they're at an expo to even stop by and visit a booth? What are the things that we think kind of make a difference in like whether or not I actually am going to go stop and talk to somebody?
Absolutely. And I think, what drives that isn't much different from what drives consumer behaviors generally, which is brand and reputation. Have I seen your name before? Do I know who you are? Do I know what you do? Is there a reason for me to come over to you to talk to you? Are you looking for someone like me? Does your brand and your messaging resonate with who I am and what I value? And so certainly name recognition, but our students do push beyond that. And, we encourage folks to do their research before attending a fair and to learn a little bit more about the companies that may be represented, large and small. But it's certainly, who are you? What do you do? And how does that align with who I am?
I think the other, to your point, Leah, that reputation piece can make it kind of easy to stop by a booth. Like, oh, I know that company. I know what they do. I use their products or I've seen their product, right? That can be really easy. I think the other piece that can help candidates is if a company has done some sort of outreach ahead of time. So that's definitely a factor that we saw that can be really influential is if a company actually reaches out in advance of the event, via email typically is the best way so that you can kind of consume it on your own time, and kind of be able to see like, okay, what is, if I don't recognize the name of the company, what is it that they do? What type of roles do they have? That information is really helpful because, again, candidates have a pretty good idea of what they want to do professionally. And so if you are a company and you give that information ahead of time, be like, great, I've never heard of this company, but now I know they have a role that I want. I'll do my research. And kind of explore and see if that's going to kind of resonate, and end up having that conversation in person. As we're going through, Leah and I would love to hear if this is kind of resonating with you in the audience. So feel free, if you want to, in the chat, let us know. Is what we're saying totally novel? If you're like, nope, we totally know this. We're already fully aware of this. Definitely let us know if that's resonating as well. I'd love to hear that.
And so, Ashley, as you know, we are a remote first organization. And so, a lot of our events are happening virtually, including our career fairs and expos. I'm curious to see, and hear from you a little bit around, do you think that this aligns with what's happening at virtual events? Is this different?
Yeah, I think virtually there's definitely I think virtually is challenging. And it definitely no matter how good the technology platform is, it's not the same as being in person. And so I think virtually there's a couple things that we heard from candidates, I think that can be difference makers. And one of the big ones is actually an ability to have a one-on-one conversation. So I think that's the biggest thing that if there's an ability to do that, actually have a conversation with someone, that's the biggest kind of factor for someone to actually go and interact with a company virtually. So I think that all those other factors still come into play. So brand and reputation, that ahead of time research, those things are great. But I think that actual ability to have a conversation is really important, because otherwise it does become kind of a passive experience to do virtually. And I think also if you're not able to make one-on-one connections, I think there's always the lure of multitasking when candidates are doing virtual events. When you're just sitting there letting the information watch over you, you're going to want to pick up your phone, you're going to want to be doing work, things like that. But if I'm actually having that opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation, I think that is really a difference maker for candidates. And so I think that does require more effort on the part of the booth holder, if you will, to use that technology or find a way to do that. But that's going to make a big difference, I think, for a lot of candidates. We'd love. Oh, we got a comment. Absolutely aligns well. Good. We're saying resonates with you all. And we'd love any other thoughts if there's any comments on kind of in-person versus virtual. There definitely has to be a little bit difference of a strategy there, certainly. But any thoughts on virtual or in-person? I'd love to hear those in the chat too. Kind of around this same thought. Leah, anything else virtual versus in-person?
No, you got
before
it.
we kind of okay. The other interesting thing is oftentimes a company rep at an expo is the first person that a candidate might speak to. And importantly, sometimes they might be the only person that someone speaks to as a company representative. So that frontline recruiter can be extremely impactful on a perception of an organization. So how important is the choice of representative, Leah? Any insights about kind of how to make sure that perception is really positive?
Absolutely. And I mean, you nailed it, Ashley. The frontline rep is the frontline. You're representing the organization. As much research that a student may have done beforehand, it really comes together with the individual who's representing your organization. They're the ones who are embodying your brand. And just keeping in mind that expos can be intimidating, it can be overwhelming. People are hot, they're tired, they've been pushed and shoved. And so there's a lot going on there with the dynamics. And so we certainly understand sometimes just like the technicality and the challenges that reps experience within in-person expo. But something that I think is really important is kind of just being welcoming and being engaging, and so we understand, hey, lots going on in the office, but if you're on your phone, I don't want to feel like I'm interrupting you. If you're not engaging or you're kind of giving me the like, don't come over here side eye, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to come over and engage with you. So, I mean, I think those are some of the standard things. But I think what I've seen that's been really effective and what we've heard from students that's worked well are having other low pressure ways to engage. And so sometimes when a student is not engaging you or your booth or your representative, it's not necessarily because they're not interested. Maybe they don't feel as prepared as they should be to talk to a representative. But if you have that QR code that they can scan, if there's another way that they can indicate interest, if there's some way that they can follow up or provide information, they may do that. They may feel a little bit on the spot, but if there's a low pressure way to engage, that's something that I would highly recommend. I mean, swag is always of interest, but we're finding that students really want swag of interest. exist. So, some of the tchotchkes aren't being taken and scooped up as the same way that they were years ago. But if there is something that's functional or something that demonstrates your brand or demonstrates, your commitment to your team and your organization, something that's unique, something, that again is functional and supports their search process, is something that we're noticing that students are certainly picking up. So I think, having, low pressure ways that students can engage, having swag that connects with your brand or resonates with students, and then also being prepared and informed about the roles that you're recruiting for. And so there's nothing worse than someone coming up to the booth and wanting to hear a little bit more about your organization, and it's just pointing to the flyer or just pointing to the QR code. And so that approachability, that friendliness should also show up in how you and your reps are talking about your organization and the roles that these students are going to be applying to. And so, what does the analyst program look like? What are some things they should be considering? What are some of the key skills that they should be developing? Being able to speak pointedly to what their candidate experience is going to be is really important and something that we encourage, and we see engagement. And then what ends up happening is, as you're excitedly talking about your rotational program or your new CPG program, other folks start picking up on that energy. They start seeing that there's folks who are excited and, engaged and interested. And so those are some of the things that we've noticed, particularly with engagement and even virtually. So that can show up there as well. So showing ways that students can connect, answering questions, providing that feedback loop is something that's really important, and kind of demonstrates, that friendliness and that welcome. It's not just the smile, but it's also having the content that speaks to why someone should want to work with you.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just say yes to all of that, because there is, I think when you think about from the candidate perspective, walking up to a booth, there's this power dynamic, right? There can be the perception that like you are the keeper of the jobs that they want. And so, yes, if you're on your phone or you are, just not looking or not being welcoming and whatever that means, candidates they don't want to bother you. And so it is, I was, on the school side, recruiter for 10 years. I get it. You're like, okay, we're in hour 3 of this fair and I am done. I'm done standing here, that sort of thing. But it's like, that ability to make sure you have those frontline representatives that can do a really good job of still welcoming candidates is really important. And yeah, I think the other piece that you mentioned, Leah, that's really important to mention what we talked about before is that ability to chat with people meaningfully. So not just someone there that's basically like a human QR code, right? Like someone who's actually going to be able to add some flavor to the information that they're able to glean on the website, for sure. And there was a comment in the chat here about actually being able to answer candidate questions. So like, I totally agree with a comment here that, if you're just constantly referring to the website, it's a little bit of like, okay, well, why are you here? Why are you here? The candidate's thinking, okay, if you came to the booth and all you're telling me to do is go to the website and scan the QR code and you're not able to provide any information, like, what's the point at the end of the day? So I think that that's really important, is that kind of overcoming that initial inertia of starting the conversation and then being able to have meaningful content when you engage with candidates as well. And I think we've all been in a position too of candidates are going to come with stumpers and they're going to ask you questions. You're like, I have no idea. But like being able to point them in the right direction for information is critical as well. So definitely all of that I think is super important. Great points, Leah.
Thank you, Ashley. So we know, certainly there's getting them, getting candidates to talk to you at the booth or chat at an event. But ultimately, you are looking to hire them. And this webinar is talking about how you get to some of those points. You want them for a job. So, Ashley, I would love to hear your insight onto factors that really matter when it comes to accepting a job for candidates. What are they really looking for? What are some of the factors that they've identified as important?
Yeah. So we got started, right? We talked about kind of big picture, top of funnel, how to get them interested, getting them into your funnel, right? And then you work, they apply, you interview them, all the way down, right? You finally gave them the job offer. Are they actually going to take it, right? At the end of the day, like, are they actually going to convert to a hopefully happy, great employee at your organization? I don't think it's going to surprise anybody that the top factor that we hear about over and over again is salary, right? Like that is important when it actually comes down to taking the job, salary really matters. The other kind of two top factors, though, one is definitely company culture. And I think that's an important one because it's such an important factor. That also means if an organization has not done a sufficient job articulating company culture, that is going to matter. So it's not just do they have good company culture, but to actually understand what that culture is. Have I gotten my questions answered about what the organization is like, who I'm going to be working with? All of those things are super important. And so answering that question about company culture and actually understanding it is important. And then the other piece is around career potential, so like growth potential. And I think that again goes back to the types of organizations that candidates are interested in. Is they're interested in organizations that they see doing well, that they see doing work that's important to them or important to their lifestyle, or that the organization has positions that they've clearly articulated have a future in the company. Unfortunately, I've heard from a lot of our early career audience over the last 6 months to a year. There's been a lot of layoffs and a lot of uncertainty in the market. And so it's not just about getting a job, but it's, can I get this job and will the job be there for me in a year or in 2 years? Is there going to be growth for me? What does that future at the organization look like? And again, it's not just about does that exist, but have you articulated that through this recruitment process? So those were the three that like really stood out and we constantly hear about from candidates. There are a lot of others that were kind of in the mix. And it was interesting because when it actually came down to accepting the job, things, they were definitely still important. So like non-salary benefits are important, flexibility is important, but those were still vastly outweighed by those three factors. So again, it's, for an individual, those might be more important. But, thinking about Leah and I, our audiences are undergraduates, early career, early MBA grads. Those three factors definitely outweighed all of them. Yeah, and there was a comment here, Leah, thanks for putting that in the chat. Comment here about other things that are important are like team shifts. So again, like this, am I on stable ground? I think that's a really key piece, especially for candidates early in their career who are really plugged into what's happening in the world. They want to know, like, am I going to accept this job? And is it going to be there when I graduate? And yeah, attrition too, right? Like, I think I know what I'm getting into, but if everyone around them is constantly changing or their manager is going to change every 6 months, that can be really daunting as well for early career candidates as well. Wonderful. Any other thoughts, Leah? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, something that, has been kind of piquing my interest and seeing a few things and conversations happening on LinkedIn is kind of like the X factor of society. And so especially with Gen Z, so some of my students and some of your candidates, have experienced, COVID high school or COVID college experiences. They have, gone through kind of major life things that have impacted their outlook in the world and their perspective and some of the things that matter to them. Something that we're seeing a lot with Gen Z is consideration around mental health and wellness. And so, they're asking questions differently in interviews around, what they should expect on the job, what support looks like, how are you going to guide them, how are you as an organization supporting them and their community. And so I think it's always interesting whenever there is some type of a large societal shift to really think about how that might be impacting your kind of incoming class or your incoming recruitment target. And what are some things? And again, it's not that you have to pivot the organization. We're not saying that you have to now take a different stance on something, but I think there is something that is in the backs of the minds of folks who are going through different recruiting processes. And so something to think about, particularly again with Gen Z, we're hearing a lot more questions and thoughts around mental health, wellness, self-care, community care. What are some of those things and how does that show up in that space?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because when we were kind of looking at some of the data that we had, I think we were a little surprised. We were like, oh, like flexibility and non-salary benefits, like those aren't the number one things that candidates look like. But then we kind of had this conversation of, well, that's accepting a job. And it was like that to your point, that filter is much higher in the funnel than it may have been in the past. So that filter of, does this align with my values, is a much higher funnel filter than in the past. And so those things are potentially going to keep candidates from even being interested. They're keeping them out of the funnel. Whereas before that would have been like, oh, if I get the job, then I'll think about that. This is, a real top line filter that they're using for sure. There was a question in the chat here. Thanks for the question. That is, how can I follow up meaningfully after a short interaction at the booth? That's a great question, Leah.
Yeah.
Let you know your thoughts, and then I'll chime in too.
Absolutely. So I think the first thought is, what is your capacity? and I say that, to going into your career fair, or whether in person or virtually, is think about what your post engagement plan is going to be and what you have the capacity to do. I think we've all been in situations where we're like, yeah, absolutely, shoot me an email, send me an email, and then you're on the road for like 4 days straight. You're also having to do work, and that email gets lost, and you're really enthusiastic and intended to connect with that candidate, but it just didn't happen. And so then that, puts a stain on the brand. And so the first thing I would say is, before you even go into the space, is think about, what do you have the capacity to do? Would you like that person to connect with you on LinkedIn? Do you have the capacity for an individual session, an informational session? And if you don't, that's okay. But perhaps you have some prescribed emails that you are kind of have like in a pre-written way that you can tailor to that candidate around what some of their questions may be. But the most important thing is, whatever you decide to do, commit to that and do that. We've been hearing a lot. I think it was the Mary Scott Research Group was saying the number of candidates who have been quote unquote ghosted in the process feels like it's increasing, but we know that the numbers of candidates and applications are just soaring. And so it's almost impossible to, get back to each person with an individualized response, which is understandable. But if you commit to that, you have to deliver that. And so, that could look like, again, a connection on LinkedIn. It could look like, something that you have within your bandwidth to offer, whether it is a resume review, whether it is a short informational session, a recommendation for ways they can strengthen their candidacy. But coming up with some of those things beforehand might help you within the trap of, oh no, I just left 50 people hanging unread in my inbox. So I'd actually love to hear your thoughts.
I feel like I had, when you were talking about that, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've lived that. Oh yeah, send me an email. I'll definitely get back to you. And then you get to your inbox and you're like, oh my God, I have 100 emails. and like, I said I was going to respond. So yes, I think that having a plan ahead of time is critically important. I think one of the things that really is disheartening about the job search process for candidates is a lack of communication. So I think even if it's a generic response of, okay, you've collected their email, even if it's just like, thank you so much for visiting, if they just get an automated response, basically, it's like, thanks so much for visiting us at the booth. Here's our recommended next step. Like, here's the link to apply for internships and jobs, or, any sort of follow-up of like, okay, great, here's the timeline for what's going to happen. I think those, even if it's that, any sort of communication, I think, is important. And just setting the expectation there, I think, to your point, Leah, set the expectation. Is that going to be an individual email? Also, we understand from a strategy perspective, sometimes you might have a generic email that they're going to be emailing versus you personally. Again, just being upfront about that is important for candidates. Everyone understands that, right? Everyone understands, like, you might not be giving out your personal email, you might be giving out a generic inbox. Totally fine. And so that's great. And so yeah, I think any sort of communication is key. And there is an expectation that this is kind of the start of a conversation. So visiting at a booth should not just like go off into the void. And I think that's the hardest part about the job search process for candidates is now most candidates apply for jobs and never hear anything, rejection or otherwise. It's just, you get ghosted, right? And so I think that's why there's kind of this frustration is like, just tell me if you're not gonna you're not gonna talk to me. So absolutely, I think that lack of communication is the biggest thing for sure. Great. The other thing that we hear, Leah, from candidates all the time when we kind of told them like, what's the overall thought about the job search process? Like, number one, above everything else, was the word overwhelming, which understandable. Any thoughts on how companies can make this process a little less whelming for candidates?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen some great examples, many from our partners around intentionally building out their kind of talent community websites that go over timelines, expectations, process. And so, whether it's outlining that there's going to be an assessment, there's going to be a higher view interview before you get to an in-person interview, just one, clarifying that process is really important. If they're looking for interns, what's that cycle, what does that look like, explaining what a talent community is really important. Just kind of clarity. I think when you feel like you know what's happening, you feel a little bit more settled in the process, and you can continue that momentum. When it feels overwhelming is when you're constantly applying, you're not hearing, you don't know. It's not clear, when you're going to hear back, what the expectations are for the role. And so providing that information up front, we find is really helpful for students, whether or not you're able to, reach out to every person individually, we understand. But if you have a website that's fully developed, or even I was recently at a career expo and the organization had a postcard that really just had, this is the timeline of our hires, this is what we're looking for, these are these are the regions that we're prioritizing, and this is what our interview process was. And so many of the students who took that card were like, oh, here are all my questions here, it's on me now to organize this in a way that flows with my job search. So I think, just being clear about what your process is, what the expectations are, and what a candidate can expect going through that, and preparing them for that as much as possible. So if you are hosting information sessions, providing that information. If you are open to connecting and creating a community with your candidates, explaining what that looks like. But we on our side, we explain that job searching is essentially a job in and of itself. And so we work with our students and our candidates on, ways they can stay organized and ways they can stay motivated, and how to, support one another in this space. And one of the things that we hear back most commonly is, just being able to get some type of a feedback or a response on the process really helps to align what their expectations should be in the process.
I agree. I think that those would all be, and your comment about the job search process being a job in and of itself, 100%. I hear that from candidates all the time, because there is such a lack of transparency now, in that it makes it so overwhelming. Of, again, you're not getting rejections, you're just getting information into the void. And then you're relying on, like, well, I'm guessing that means no after X amount of time. That's kind of how you're just like, okay, hope for the best. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that postcard's a great idea. I wish everybody did that. We definitely have some time for audience questions. So if there are any questions, feel free to drop those either in the chat or the Q&A, and Leah and I will go through those as well. Leah, any other comments before we get to some questions?
No, I think we're good. I have a question for you, Ashley.
Oh, okay.
As the questions roll in, and I think knowing your work and knowing that you work with an audience that is in this really interesting kind of career space. I'm curious for you, particularly as women are pursuing like the MBA and thinking about that. What have you found to be their most frequent motivating factors for them pursuing the MBA, pursuing these opportunities? What's driving a lot of their activity in the marketplace right now?
Yeah, and this definitely, I love talking about kind of the reasons behind an MBA pursuit and how that then often influences a choice of job. And some candidates go into the kind of MBA journey with a very specific job in mind, but I think a lot of candidates go into that with a little more abstract ideas on why they're pursuing an MBA. Definitely, I think salary potential is one, again, kind of aligning with why candidates take jobs. The average starting salary for an MBA grad, I think the number is like 150K ish, but it can be double that at some institutions, and that's oftentimes a very great proposition for candidates for a generation that has a lot of things like student loans, facing a really uncertain future, might have responsibilities for caring for parents or other family members, that is a very practical reason why candidates pursue the MBA, which again can kind of influence their job choice too. As candidates are thinking, oh, it's my dream job, or I could go do this other job and get paid really well and suffer for 3 years. There's that sacrifices sometimes being willing to be made for a salary. I think the other piece is making a transition, whether that be kind of industry or career. I think some candidates do what they're passionate about as undergrads, do that for a couple of years and realize, maybe there's not that growth potential that they're looking for. And so sometimes, an MBA is a great way to pivot. It's a great way to pivot industries, pivot functions. I think the other piece is candidates who want to move into leadership or management roles, who want to lead strategy, who want to lead organizations. An MBA is a great way to do that. So when you look at, who's in the C-suite, who's in senior leadership, there's a lot of people out there who have MBAs, and that's a great way to kind of springboard into that management type role. And I think that's a big factor for the MBA too, is am I going to do an MBA program that's going to allow me to get a job where I'm actually going to be making strategic decisions? Am I going to be influencing the future of organizations? And sometimes that's not just a selfish pursuit of, I want to have power, but it's much more to what we talked about earlier of candidates really being tuned into organizations that align with them and their values. And so the strategy of an organization that has influence on culture and on the world that we live in, candidates want to influence that strategy because that's influencing their day-to-day lives. So I think all of that makes the MBA a really important pursuit for many candidates. And again, will influence the type of jobs that they're looking at because again, salary really matters to them. Company culture matters to them, and that growth potential really matters to them. And that is not just a job, but it's also where they're going to get an MBA too.
Thanks for that, Ashley.
Oh yeah, there's hey, I got up on my little soapbox there for a minute. There was a question to consider, which is kind of what misconceptions do students commonly have about recruiting? So I think we experience this too, Leah. It's like what they think is actually happening. Person's like, okay, calm down. This is the reality of what it is.
Yeah. And I think, that moment actually happens when it's like, they're going through the process, they're doing everything right, and they're still not getting responses. And I think that there's a misconception from students at times that they're doing something wrong and not get, as opposed to it's a really competitive field. And so we're hearing that, some of our partners are getting thousands of applications for a dozen first year analyst spots. So I think there's a misconception that that they're doing something wrong. And so then they start trying to apply things that they're hearing on like TikTok and what they should be doing differently. And so I am going to send a LinkedIn to every person at this company, and I am going to do this, as opposed to really kind of having faith in the recruitment process. And so that's the part around like unlocking talent, is that when you have a consistent and clear process for students, it gives some, confidence in their ability to navigate through your process. Because otherwise they're thinking, well, you just didn't see me. I just didn't stand out enough. I just didn't do this. And then we start getting some of, I remember a friend of mine shared with me that a box of cupcakes arrived on his desk. And he said, I just don't quite know what to do with this because now this candidate is standing out, but probably not in the way that they desired. But again, it was because at some points in their recruitment process were unclear. So I think there's that. I think, particularly, we get a lot of questions from students around, how they can and should use AI. I think there's a feeling that so many of the applicant tracking systems out there are just looking for keywords. And so all I need to do is flood my resume with keywords, and that's going to advance me into the process. I don't really need to do that much work in my resume and cover letter. I can just throw that into, an AI generator, and it'll give me what I need, in order to do that. And so I think there's still some questions about that, but I do think even just like the process, the ATS of it all, what are you actually looking at and how are you evaluating my candidacy? And I think it's leading to, students feeling like, well, I'm just going to flood it with keywords. And unfortunately, maybe string together a sentence that doesn't actually mean anything or doesn't reflect what I actually did or what I know. But shows the keywords for this industry. So it's kind of seeing that a little bit play out for the candidate experience.
Yeah, I definitely think the lack of transparency in the process creates an opportunity for misinformation in the process. And that's where, yes, if you get all your application tips from TikTok, there's not everything's gonna be great on there. There's some good ones. But yeah, I think that lack of transparency, I think that's pretty consistent. I would say most of the time the process is not transparent. And so it's like it is a wonderful beacon of light when it's like, oh my gosh, here's a organization that's really transparent. They have this great postcard where they told me exactly what this is going to be like, right? Any opportunities like that could really help candidates, because otherwise they're going to look to the internet broadly for the answers to their many questions about that as well. Wonderful. Well, I think that we wrapped up most of the questions that were posed. So thank you to our audience for asking some great questions today. I think we're going to turn it over to Rachel to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley and Leah. That was really great. Those insights were wonderful. It's always so interesting to hear the student perspective for sure. I think some takeaways that really stood out to me was really around leadership, that students are interested in being the future leaders and they want to see that pathway to future growth. Salary is still important and company culture is really essential, workplace flexibility, but that career growth potential is also really important. And also, how high in the funnel this is really showing up for them. So, maybe this was a decision in the past around whether to take one job or another, but now it's maybe actually precluding students from even recruiting at certain companies. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, of course, clear is kind, right? Transparency and clarity around the process is what's going to give students the confidence they need to try and to keep moving forward and to navigate. So those were, I thought, really big standouts for me. And in general, for all of you, I hope these insights are helpful and will be helpful as you're thinking about your recruiting practices and goals for 2025. I would love to know more about what you're thinking. So please, reach out to me to talk more. And we're going to keep this conversation going again next month as well. So I hope you will save the date for our next session of the Unlocking Talent webinar series. We're going to be exploring closing the pipeline gap. So insights on retaining women in the recruitment process. Many organizations focus heavily on identifying and attracting talent early. And for women in particular, they're dropping out of the interview pipeline. So we're going to, talk directly with, or we've gone directly to undergraduate women and we'll share with you their insights around perspectives on this issue. So really looking forward to that conversation for some actionable strategies to reduce that dropout rate. And really improve women talent retention in your hiring process specifically. And beyond sharing these insights, Forte is really here to be your implementation partner. From strengthening your talent acquisition strategy or advancing inclusion initiatives within your organization, we have the expertise and the networks that you need to turn strategy into results. So please reach out, chat about your specific needs, or hear tips on what some of our successful corporate partners are doing to really find success with recruiting with our programs. And we're always excited to hear from folks who want to participate in our mission and may find our resources valuable. So look forward to connecting with you. And thank you again, Ashley and Leah, and for everyone for spending time with us today. We look forward to our next webinar. And until then, hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.